Meet Geoffrey Hudson, a man of very small stature who had a very big life and was a real-life inspiration for Tyrion Lannister. Geoffrey was born in 1619, and at only 18 inches tall, he was quite possibly the smallest man in England at the time, probably the world. For perspective, the current world's smallest man is 25 inches tall, so Geoffrey was a full 7 inches shorter than that. He was born into a poor family in Rutland, which suitably for the smallest man in England, is the smallest county in England. His 4 siblings and parents were all of average size, but Geoffrey's diminished proportions were obvious from a very early age. The leading theory for this at the time was that his mother had choked on a gherkin whilst pregnant, which probably wasn't the cause. For any medieval viewers watching this, modern science generally now concludes that the only major risk of choking on a gherkin whilst pregnant is, well, choking. In the 17th century, opportunities were generally very limited for people with dwarfism, especially poor people with dwarfism, where manual labour was their main source of income. So when he was 7 years old, Geoffrey's parents released him into the care of the local duke, the Duke of Buckingham, who saw value in Geoffrey as a rarity of nature. It sounds like exploitation, but Geoffrey's parents saw this as the only chance for him to have a better life. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Now, the Duke saw a political opportunity in Geoffrey, and decided to do a bit of royal brown-nosing by re-gifting him to the wife of King Charles I, Queen Henrietta Maria. How he did this was pretty incredible. The Duke put on a banquet for the King and Queen, and after they'd had a few courses, suddenly the trumpets all blare out and 2 footmen enter the hall carrying a huge pie. This pie is then placed before Queen Henrietta Maria, and it begins to move. It shakes from side to side, and everyone's like, what's going on? Pies aren't meant to move. Then a tiny fist punches out of the crust, and out leaps an equally tiny Geoffrey Hudson, 18 inches tall and dressed in a miniature suit of armour. He marched up and down the table waving a flag, everybody loves it. And then he stops in front of the Queen and gives her a big bow. She is over the moon with her gift, and of course, she keeps him. He's initially taken into her care as a sort of novelty pet, and he joins her entourage of curiosities, which also include a monkey and a 7-foot 6-inch tall Staffordshire giant called Walter Parsons. For guests of the Queen, he'd do this joke where he'd walk around in a big coat and pull out a whole loaf of bread from one pocket and Geoffrey Hudson out of the other. But eventually the Queen starts to actually really like Geoffrey, and he becomes her sort of right-hand man, much like Tyrion was for Daenerys Targaryen. He gets schooling, he goes hunting and shooting with the Queen, he's given a salary of £50 a year, and he's known to the most powerful people in the land as Lord Minimus. It's turning out that his parents really did make a great decision sending him away. Then, in 1642, things take a turn. Civil war breaks out in England. And as a member of the royal household, Geoffrey is drawn into this conflict. He ends up fighting for the royalist army and is actually given the rank of captain in the cavalry. Of course, the royalists lost the war and Charles I was beheaded, so Geoffrey, with the Queen, flees to France in exile. Now, back in England, Geoffrey had become quite a well-liked member of the court, and now as a captain of the cavalry as well, he was no longer going to suffer being treated like a pet or a clown. However, his fame and standing in London didn't quite carry over to France. He's repeatedly mocked by members of the Queen's new crowd, and eventually Geoffrey loses his temper, and after one particularly derogatory insult, challenges a courtier called Charles Crofts to a duel. Even in the duel, Charles didn't take Geoffrey seriously, and to further mock him, and brought a water pistol to the fight instead of a gun. Geoffrey, however, did take it seriously and shot Charles right in the head. Unfortunately for Geoffrey, duelling had been outlawed in France, and Charles was from a very powerful family. Geoffrey was sentenced to death for the murder. Thankfully, the Queen interceded, and instead he was just banished from the court and sent back to England. Now 25, but still only 18 inches tall, Geoffrey had lost his social status, his income, and his whole new life at court. Things could not get much worse. Or could they? On the way back to England, Geoffrey's ship was captured by Barbary pirates. He was then kidnapped and taken to North Africa, where he spent the next 25 years labouring away as a slave. Eventually, after 2.5 decades, Geoffrey is rescued by an English ship and makes his way back to England. This is a very different England to the one he left. The monarchy has been restored, but the Queen had died and Catholics were now heavily persecuted. A religion that Geoffrey had unfortunately converted to for the King and Queen. Little Geoffrey returned to his home county of Rutland with some huge stories to tell. Not only that, but he'd also doubled in height during his years in captivity, now standing at a relatively statuesque 3 foot 9 inches tall. He put this down to his years of hardship, but was more likely due to a change in his pituitary gland, which had caused his dwarfism in the first place. 7 years after returning to England, and now quite penniless, Geoffrey travelled down to London to seek a pension from the royal court. Unfortunately, he was arriving at a time of great anti-Catholic hysteria in the capital, and a supposed plot against the new king. So Geoffrey was arrested, simply for being a Roman Catholic, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And after only recently escaping slavery in Africa, was now imprisoned in London for the next 4 years. Geoffrey was finally released in 1680 at the age of 61, and sadly died 2 years later. Despite all his previous status and fame, despite surviving civil wars, exile, duels, pirates and slavery, Captain Geoffrey Hudson was buried in an unmarked Catholic pauper's grave somewhere in London. But that's not the end of Geoffrey Hudson's story. In 2022, a pair of his tiny trousers, personally tailored for him when he was in the Queen's court, and just 29 centimetres in length, sold at auction for nearly £10,000. That's over $13,000. Showing that, to a private Belgian collector at least, the legend of Geoffrey Hudson lives on. Thanks for watching. For more cracking stuff, like and subscribe.